Chapter 3 6:13 a.m. Low strands of cloud in a rinsed-out, pre-dawn sky. Last night's drizzle still sequined on the black metal carapaces of the Rap shuttles, Evercrete landing apron damp with it and spots of rain still in the air. Joey Driscoll came out of the canteen with a tall canister of self-heating coffee in each hand, arms spread wide as if to balance the weight, eyes heavy-lidded with end-of-shift drowse. His mouth unzipped in a cavernous yawn. The siren hit, upward winding like the threat of a gigantic dentist's drill. "Oh, for fuck's sake!" For a moment he stood in weary disbelief. Then the coffee canisters hit the Evercrete and he was running resignedly for the tackle room. Above his head the sirens made it to their first hitched-in breath and started the cranking whine all over again. Big LCLS panels on the hangar lintels lit with flashing amber. Off to the left, under the sirens, he heard the deeper-throated grind of the rapid response shuttle's turbines kicking in. Maybe a minute and a half tops before they hit pitch. 2 more minutes for crew loading, and then they'd be lifting, dipping and bobbing on the apron like dogs trying to tug loose from a tight leash. Anyone late aboard was going to get their balls cut off. He made the tackle room door just as Zdena darted out of it, tactical vest still not fully laced on, helmet dangling off the lower edge, XM still long-stocked in her hand from standing in the rack, wide-mouthed Slavic grin as she saw him. "Where's my fucking coffee, Joe?" she had to shout over the sirens. "Back there on the concrete. You want it, go lick it up." He gestured up in exasperation at the noise. "I mean, fuck! 40 minutes to shift change and we get this shit. Why they pay us, cowboy?" She snapped the XM's stock down to carbine length and secured it there, shoved the weapon into the long stick-grip sheath on her thigh and focused on pulling the buckles tight on her tack vest. Joey shouldered past her. "They pay us?" Into the riot of the tackle room at alert, a dozen other bodies, yelling, cursing at their superannuated gear, laughing out the tension like dogs barking. Joe grabbed vest, helmet, T-mask off the untidy piles on the counter, didn't bother putting any of it on. Experience had taught him to do that in the belly of the Rap as it tilted out over the Pacific. He gripped the upright barrel of an XM in its recess on the rack, struggled briefly with it as the release catch failed to give, finally snapped the assault rifle free and headed back for the door. 40 fucking minutes, man! Zdena was already sitting on the lowered tailgate of Blue One, helmet fitted loosely, unmasked, grinning at him as he panted up and hauled himself, arse slithering aboard. She leaned in to yell above the screech of the turbines. "Hey, cowboy, you ready for rock and roll?" He could never work out if she was hamming up the Natasha accent or not. They hadn't been working together that long. She'd come in with the new hires at the end of May. He figured, and etiquette said you never asked, she was probably licensed outland labor, at least as legal as he was these days. He doubted she'd hopped the fence the way he had, though. More likely she was across from the Siberian coastal strip, or maybe one of those Russian factory rafts farther south, part of that fucking Pacific Rim labor fluidity they were always talking about. Of course, for all he knew, she might even be West Coast born and bred. Out here, mangled English didn't necessarily signify anything. Wasn't like back in the Republic, where they blanket enforced a Manglic punished the kids in school for speaking anything else. In the Rim states, English was strictly a trade tongue. You learned it to the extent you needed it, which, depending on the barrio you grew up in, didn't have to be that much. "You gotta," still panting from the sprint, no breath to yell, "stop watching all those old movies, Zed. This is gonna be a fucking punt around the deep water mark, scaring the shit out of some idiot plankton farmer who's forgotten to upgrade his clear tags for the month. Fucking waste of time." "I don't think, Joe," Zdena nodded out along the line of shuttles. "Is 4 boats they got powering up. Lot of firepower for plankton farmer." Yeah, you'll see." The dust-off went pretty smoothly, for their ship anyway. Last month's practice drills paying off, it seemed, despite the groans. 8 troops in, standard deployment strength, all webbed into their crash seats along the inner walls of the shuttle's belly, grinning tension grins. Joe had his tactical vest all hooked up by then, vital signs wired in, though he wondered if anyone bothered to look at that shit anymore now they'd downgraded cockpit command crew from 3 to 2. But at least the auto-meds would look after him in a firefight, and in the final analysis the vest was somewhere to hang all the spare XM magazines and boarding tools. Briefing came in over the comset in his ear, drummed from the speakers set in the roof of the shuttle like an echo. "This is a Class 2 aerial breach incursion. Repeat, Class 2 incursion. We expect no combat." He leaned out and nodded triumphantly down the line at Zdena. "Told you fucking so." "But maintain combat alertness nonetheless. Mask and gloves to be worn throughout mission. Apply anti-contaminant gel as for biohazard operations. Please note there is no reason to assume a biohazard situation. These are precautions only. We have a downed Collin spacecraft. Repeat, a downed Collin spacecraft inside coastal limits." Zdena shot him the look right back again. "Fucking spaceship?" someone yelped from the row of seats on the other wall. "Medical teams will stand by until Blue Squad completes a sweep. Be prepared to encounter crash casualties. Squad division in deployment teams as follows. Team Alpha, Driscoll on point, Hernandez and Joe to follow. Team Beta." He tuned it out. Old news. Current rotations put him at the sharp end of deployment for the next 3 weeks. Now he couldn't make up his mind if he was pissed at that or glad. This was going to be a fucking trip. Outside of TV and a couple of virtual tours of the Collin Museum in Santa Cruz, he'd never seen a real spaceship. But one thing he did know. They didn't land those fucking things on Earth. Not since the nanorack towers went up everywhere, disappearing into the clouds like blackened steel beanstalks from that stupid fucking story his gran used to tell him when he was a kid. The only spaceships Joe knew about outside of historical footage were the ones that occasionally cropped up at the slow end of the news feeds, docking serenely at the mushroom top flanges of those fairy tale stalks into the sky, their only impact economic. Just returned from Habitat 9, the haulage tug Weaver's cargo is expected to make a substantial dent in the precious metals market for this quarter. Measures requested by the Association of African Metal-Producing States to protect Earthside mining are still before the World Trade Organization, where representatives of the HAB-9 consortium contend that such restraint of trade is... so forth. These days, spaceships stayed in space, where they belonged, and everything they carried went up or came down on the rack elevators. Perfect quarantine, he'd heard some late-night talking head call it once, and extremely energy-efficient into the bargain. A spaceship coming down was the scenario from some cheap disaster flick, or even cheaper paranoid alien invasion Xperia show off the Jesus Land channels. For it to happen for real could only mean that something, somewhere, had gone super wrong. Oh, dude, this I've got to fucking see. He was still applying the biosealant gel to his face when the shuttle banked about and the tailgate cracked open. Cold Pacific air came flushing in with a scream of the turbines and the grey dawn light. He unbuckled and shuffled down the line to the cable hoist. His pulse knocked lightly in his temples. Something that was too much fun to be fear coursed in his blood. He wrapped the T-mask across his face, pulled down the breathing filter to his chin, pressed the edges of it all into the biosealant. The wind whipped in off the ocean outside, chilling the newly pasted skin of his cheeks where they were still exposed at either side of the mask. There was an illusory sense of safety behind the curve of impact-resistant, one-way glass and its warm, amber, heads-up projected displays, as if his whole body was sitting back here instead of just bits of his face. They got warned about that shit all the time. Some crudely rendered virtual drill sergeant in the bargain basement Texan software that was all filigree steel security's training budget ran to. Inexplicably, the badly lip-synced figure had a British accent. "Whole body awareness, you horrible little man," the construct was wont to bellow whenever he tripped one of the program's stoppers. "Are your legs on loan? Is your chest a temporary appendage? Whole body awareness is the only fucking thing that will keep your whole body alive." Yeah, whatever. He snapped the cable onto his vest, turned back to the belly of the shuttle and the observation camera fixed in the ceiling. He made the OK sign with finger and thumb, coughed into the induction mic at his throat. "Point. Ready to deploy." "I hear you, Point. On my mark. 3, 2, 1, drop." The cable jolted into motion, and he fumbled his XM to readiness in both hands, leaning out so he could peer down at what lay below. At first it was just the endless roll and white-capped slap of the Pacific outward in all directions. Then he got a fix on the ship. Not what he'd been expecting. It looked like a huge plastic packing case, awash in the water, barely floating. The hull was mostly a scorched black, but he could make out streaks of white with the remains of nano-etched lettering, some kind of corporate insignia that he supposed must have skinned off in the heat of re-entry. He dropped closer, saw what looked like an open hatch set in a section that was still above water.
Command, are we sure this thing isn't going to sink? Affirmative, Point. Call-in specs say she should stay afloat indefinitely. I've got an open hatch here, and with this wind and the waves, I figure she's got to be shipping some water. Repeat, Point. Vessel should float indefinitely. Check the hatch.
His boots hit the hull with a solid clank about a dozen meters off from the hatch and a little downward. Ocean water swirled around his feet ankle deep, then sucked back. He sighed and unclipped from the cable.
Understood, Command. Off descender. We'll maintain.
He crouched a little and worked his way up the shallow slope toward the hatch, peering down into it. Water had sloshed into the opening. He could see it glistening wetly on the rungs of a ladder that led down to a second, inner hatch, which he assumed had to be the end of an airlock. As he watched, a fresh surge washed over the hatch combing and rinsed down onto the ladder, dripping and splashing to the bottom of the lock. He peered a bit more, then shrugged and clambered down the ladder until he was hanging off the lower rungs just above the inner hatch. The water down there was about 3 fingers deep, slopping back and forth with the tilt of the vessel in the waves. Just below the surface, the mouldings of the hatch looked unnaturally clean, like something seen at the bottom of a rock pool. There was a warning. Caution, pressure must equalize before hatch will open. Joe figured whatever pressure there was inside the hull must be pretty close to Earth's standard then, because someone, or something, had already unsealed the inner hatch. It was just hanging open just enough to let the water drain very slowly through the crack. He grunted.
Weren't for that, fucking airlock'd be a quarter full already from the slop.
He tapped his mic.
Command, I've got a cracked inner hatch here. Don't know if that's the systems or, human agency. Noted. Proceed with caution.
He grimaced. He'd been hoping for a withdraw call.
Yeah, or failing that, some fucking backup, Command. This baby's come from space, right? From Mars, most likely. No fucking telling what kind of bugs might be loose in there. That's what nanorack quarantine's for, right?
For a moment he thought about backing up anyway. But
you're equipped, he could already hear the patient voice explaining to him. You're masked and gelled against biothreat, and we don't in any case anticipate. You have no valid reason to query your orders.
And Zdaina's voice.
Why they pay us, cowboy?
And from the others, jeers. He shook off a tiny shudder, moved down a couple of rungs, and put a boot through the water to press gingerly on the hatch. It gave, fractionally. Great.
Point?
Nothing, he said sourly. Just proceeding with extreme fucking caution. He braced one hand flat on the wall of the airlock, stamped harder on the hatch, impatient now, and it caved in under his foot. Hinged heavily down to the side, dumping the water through into a darkened interior with a long, hollow splash. The sudden drop caught him unawares. He lost his grip on the rung above. Fell, grabbed clumsily with one flailing gloved hand, missed and clouted the side of his head on the ladder as he tumbled. He went right through the opened inner hatch, had time for one garbled yell. Fire! And fetched up in a heap on what must have been the sidewall of the corridor below. Shock of impact. His teeth clipped the edge of his tongue. Sharp bang in his shoulder. Gouge in the ribs where one end of the XM jabbed him on the way down. He hissed the pain out through gritted teeth. For the rest, he seemed to have landed on something soft. He lay still for a moment, checking for damage reports from his tangled limbs. Total body awareness, right, Sarge?
He summoned a grin. Didn't think he'd broken anything. Looking up, he figured it for not much more than a 3-meter drop. He blew a hard, chuckled breath of relief into the mask filter, completed his expletive quietly. Fuck. Point? Command came through. Yeah, finally fucking concerned now. Report your status? Are you injured? I'm fine. He propped himself up on one arm, squinted around in the gloom, and snapped on the helmet light. Just took a digger. Nothing to... The edge of the beam clipped something that didn't make any sense. His head jerked around. The beam hit full on what he'd seen. Oh, fuck, man. You gotta be... And suddenly, with a flood of disbelieving comprehension, he gagged, vomit flooding up and into the mask, burning his nose and throat, as he saw for the first time exactly what the soft thing was that had broken his fall. Chapter 4. Sevgi Ertekin awoke to the curious conviction that it was raining in dirty grey sheets all over the city. In June? She blinked. Somewhere outside the open window of the apartment she heard a siren calling her. Intimate and nostalgic as the sound of the adzan she still missed from the old neighbourhood, but freighted with an adrenaline significance the prayer call would never match. Rusted professional reflex surfaced in her, then rolled over and sank as memory came aboard. Not her call any more. In any case, the melancholy caught-breath cry of the cop car, wherever it was distant. Noises of commerce from the street market 6 floors below almost drowned it out. There was shouting, mostly good-humoured, and music from stall-mounted sound systems, frenetic neo-arabesque that she was in no mood for currently. The day had started without her. Against her own better judgment, she turned over to face the window. Glare from the sun hit her in the face and drove her to squinting. Varipolara drapes billowed in the breeze from outside, incandescent with morning light. It appeared she'd forgotten to remote them down to opaque again. An empty bottle of Jameson's was partly hidden where the curtain hem brushed the floor. Someone, yeah, right, Sev, who would that be, had rolled it away across the polished wooden boards of the living room when it had nothing left to offer. The same living room where she'd apparently slept, fully clothed on the couch. A moment's groggy reflection brought in corroborative memory. She'd sat there after the party broke up, and she'd killed the rest of the bottle. Vague recollection of talking quietly to herself, the smoky warmth of the whiskey as it went down. She'd been thinking all the time she'd just have one more. She'd just have one more. Then she'd get up and... She hadn't gotten up. She'd passed out. This is new, Sev. Usually you make it to a bed. She made a convulsive effort and heaved herself fully into a sitting position, then wished she hadn't moved quite so rapidly. The contents of her head seemed to shift on some kind of internal stalk. A long wave of nausea rolled through her, and her clothing felt suddenly like restraints. She'd lost her boots at some point. They were keeled over on opposite sides of the room, about as far apart as the dimensions allowed, but shirt and pants remained. She had a vague memory of rolling hilariously about on her back after everyone was gone, trying to tug off the boots and then the socks. In this, at least, it seemed she'd succeeded, but obviously the rest had defeated her. And now the shirt was rucked up and bunched under her arms, and her profiler cups had peeled and worked loose from her breasts as she tossed and turned. One seemed to have ended up in her armpit. The other was gone altogether. Some way below her waist, her pants had somehow twisted about until they were no longer loose. Her guts were similarly tight. Her bladder was uncomfortably full, and her head was settling to a steady throb. And it's raining. She looked up, and a sudden raw anger took hold as she traced the low hissing to its real source. In one corner of the room, the ancient JVC entertainment deck was still on. Whatever chip was in had played to its conclusion, and the temperamental default system had failed to return to blue screen. The monitor showed a snow dance of static instead, and the gentle hiss of it filled up the bass of hearing below the sounds of the city outside. Filled up everything like... Her mouth tightened. She knew what chip she'd been watching. She couldn't remember, but she knew. It's not fucking raining, all right? She lurched to her feet and stabbed the deck to silence. For a moment, then, she stood in her apartment as if it weren't her own, as if she'd broken in to steal something. She felt the steady flog of her pulse in her throat, and she knew she was going to cry. She shook her head instead, violently, trading the tears for an intense, sonar-pulsing pain, stumbled through the bedroom to the ensuite, fingers pressing to the ache. There was a plastic bottle of generic headache pills on the shelf there, and beside it a foil of Sin. Or more precisely, K-37 Synodrive, military-issue superfunction capsules, her share of a black market trickle into NYPD way back when, and several times the strength of anything the street liked to call Sin. She'd used the caps a handful of times before and found them scarily effective. They stimulated synaptic response and physical coordination, sidelined pretty much everything else, and they did it fast. Sevgi wavered for a moment, realized she had things to do today, even if she couldn't remember right now exactly what they were. Whole fucking city self-medicates these days anyway, Sev. Get over it. She pressed a couple of the mil-issue capsules out of the foil and was about to dry swallow them when a fragment of peripheral vision caught up with her. She strode back into the bedroom. Hey! The girl in the bed couldn't have been much more than 18 or 19. Blinking awake, she seemed even younger, but the body beneath the single sheet was too full for the waif-like look. She sat up, and the sheet slipped off improbably thrusting breasts. From the way they moved, it was a sub-cute muscle web, not implants, that was pulling the trick. Pricey work for something that young. Sevgi made her for someone's trophy date, the whole fake bonobo thing, but was too hungover to rack her head for faces from the party. Maybe whoever brought her had gotten too wasted to remember all his accessories when he went home. "Who told you could sleep in here?" The girl blinked again. "You did." "Oh." Sevgi's anger crumbled. She rode out another wave of nausea and swallowed. "Well, get your stuff together and go home. Party's over." She headed back to the bathroom, closed the door carefully, and then, as if to emphasize her own last words, hooked over and vomited into the toilet. When she was sure she could hold them down, she took the K-37 slugs with a glass of water, and then propped herself under the warm drizzle of the shower while she waited for the effects to kick in. It didn't take long. The tweaked chemistry in the drug made for rapid uptake as well as retained clarity, and the lack of anything else in her stomach sped the process even more. The throbbing in her head began to subside. She got off the tiled wall and groped for the gel, started gingerly on her scalp with it. The soaked and matted mass of her hair collapsed into silky submission, and the foam from the gel ran down her body in clumped suds. It was like shedding 5-day-old clothes. She felt new strength and focus stealing through her like a fresh skeleton. When she stepped dripping out of the shower 10 minutes later, the pain was wrapped away in chemical gauze, and a spiky, clear-sighted brilliance had taken its place. Which was a mixed blessing. Drying herself in the mirror, she saw the weight that was gathering on her haunches and grimaced. She hadn't been inside a gym in months, and her home-based Cassie Rogers Astrotone, as used by real Mars Trip personnel, program was settling into oblivion like a deflating circus tent. The incriminating evidence of the neglect was right there, and you couldn't take mil-issue slugs to make it go away, like you could with pain. The ludicrously perfect flanks of the girl in her bed flitted through her mind. The jutting designer chest. She looked at the swell of her own breasts, gathered low on her ribs and tilting away to the sides. Fuck it, you're in your 30s now, Sevgi. Not trying to impress the boys at Bosphorus Bridge anymore, are we? Give it a rest. Anyway, you're due. That always makes it worse. Her hair was already settling back into its habitually untidy black bell as it dried out. She took a couple of swipes at it with a brush, then gave up in exasperation. In the mirror, her largely Arab ancestry glowered back at her, cheekbones high and wide, face hawk-nosed and full-lipped, set with heavy-lidded amber flake eyes. Ethan had once said there was something tigerish in her face, but Sevgi, sharp from the sin and not yet made up, suspected that today she looked more like a disgruntled crow. The idea dragged a grin to the surface, and she made cawing noises at herself in the mirror. dumped the towel and went to get dressed. Discovered a desire for coffee. The kitchen, predictably, looked like a war zone. Every available counter was piled with used crockery. Sevgi tracked the party dishes through the debris, dark green remnants like tiny rags where the plates had held stuffed vine leaves, brittle fragments of cigar-borek pastry, eggplant and tomato in oil gone cold, half a lamakun left upside down so that it looked like a stiffly dried-out washcloth. In the sink, a small turret of stacked pans reared drunkenly out at her like some robot jack-in-the-box. Effie's export bottles were gathered in squat, orderly rows along one wall on the floor. Their slightly sour breath rose up to fill the kitchen space. Good party. A few of her departing guests had burbled it at her as she let them out. An abrupt avalanche of memory confirmed it. A tangle of friends throughout the apartment, sprawled on sofas and beanbags, food and drink, and gesturing with mouths full, comfortable hilarity. It had been a good party. Yeah, pity you had to murder that bottle of Irish afterward. Why was that, Sev? She felt how her face twitched and knew her eyes had gone flat and hard with a feeling as it rolled across her. You know why. The sin came on behind the thought, spiky and bright. She had a sudden insight into how easy it would be to kill someone in this state of mind. The phone spoke, soft and reasonable, like biting into cotton wool. I have registered contact Tom Norton on the line. Will you accept the call? Recollection of what she had to do that day fell on her like a brick. She groaned and went to fetch the rest of the painkillers. The first wrong thing was the car. Norton usually ran a ludicrous half-acre of antique Cadillac soft top with a front grille like a sneer and a hood you could have sunbathed on. He was grin proud of the fucking thing too, which was odd given its history. Built in some Alabama sweatshop before Norton was born, it was a vehicle he'd have been summarily arrested for driving in New York if he hadn't paid almost double the auction price to have the original IC engine ripped out and replaced with the mag drive from a discontinued line of Japanese powerboats. He'd blown yet another month's wages on having it polymered from snout to tail, immortalizing the catalogue of scrapes and dents it had collected during its previous life out in Jesusland. Sevgi couldn't get him to see that it was practically a metaphor for the idiocies of the past it came from. Today, in an abrupt spike of sin insight, she realized it was the kind of car Ethan would have loved to own, and that was why this aberration in Norton's otherwise flawless Manhattan male urbanity drove her time and again to a silent, waspish anger. Today, he wasn't driving it. Instead, as she let herself out onto the street, still settling a grabbed-at-random tailored summer jacket onto her shoulders, he unfolded from the back seat of a dark blue auto-drive teardrop that was recognizably from the Colin Pool. He stood there looking as smooth and self-contained as the vehicle he'd stepped out of, a poem in groomed competence. The filaments of grey in his close-cropped hair glinted in the sun. The tanned future presidential candidate Caucasian features that he swore were his own crinkled around pale blue eyes. He gave her a trademark slanted grin. "Morning, Sev. Rise and shine." "Yeah, right. What time do you wind it up in the end?" He'd gone home well before midnight, chemically unimpaired as far as Sevgi could remember. "Don't remember. Late." She pushed past him and dumped herself in the car, slid over to let him in beside her. The door hinged down and the teardrop pulled smoothly away, cornered into West 118th and kept going. Traffic surged around them. They'd cruised 4 blocks before Sevgi woke up to the direction and the second jarring nail in the day's expected course. She glanced across at Norton. "What's the matter? You leave something at the office?" "Not going to the office, Sev." "Yeah, that's what I thought we agreed to yesterday. So why are we headed east?" Norton grinned again. "Not going out to Kaku either. Change of plans. No free fall for you today." The relief that rolled through her at the news felt like sun on her skin, suddenly warming and way ahead of any accompanying curiosity. She really hadn't been looking forward to the gut-swooping elevator ride up the Kaku Nanorack, or the creeping around weightless when they got to the top. They had drugs to take the sting out of both experiences at the rack facility, but she wasn't at all sure they'd mix well with the sin already coursing through her system. And the thought of starting an investigation in this state, with her abused brain and belly bleating protest at the 0G and the earth rolling past, somewhere sickeningly far below, already had her palms lightly greased with sweat. "Right. So you want to tell me where we are going?" "Sure. JFK Suborb Terminal. Got the 11 o'clock shuttle to SFO." Sevgi sat up. "What happened? Horkin's Pride overshoot the docking slot?" "You could say that." Norton's tone was dry. "Overshot Kaku. Overshot Sagan. Splashed down about 100 clicks off the California coast." "Splashed down? They're not supposed to land those things." "Tell me about it. From what I hear, only the main crew section made it down in one piece. The rest is wreckage along a line from somewhere in Utah to the coast, or burned up on re-entry. The Rim authorities are having what's left towed back to the Bay Area, where you and I will crack it open and dazzle them all with our lucid analysis of just what the fuck went wrong." Those are Nicholson's words, by the way, not mine. "Yeah, I guessed." Norton spoke four-letter words the way a miser spends wafers, when he was utterly inescapably driven to it, or when they belonged to someone else. It seemed to be a linguistic rather than a moral quirk, though, because he evinced no apparent embarrassment or distaste when he quoted other people like this, or when Sevgi swore, which was a lot of the time these days. "So how come you didn't phone me earlier with this shit?" "Believe me, I tried. You weren't answering." "Oh." "Yeah. So I covered for you with Nicholson, if that's what you were wondering. Said you were somewhere downtown chasing leads from the Spring Street bust. You were going to meet me at the terminal." Sevgi nodded to herself. "Thanks, Tom. I owe you one." She owed him more than one. Quite a lot more over the last 2 years, but neither of them would ever acknowledge it. The debt lay unspoken between them, like complicity, like family. And Nicholson, anyway, they both agreed, was an asshole. "You think any of them are still alive?" Norton wondered. Sevgi stared out of the window at the traffic, marshalling facts from the file. "Horkin's Pride is a 5 Series. They built them to survive crash landing at the Mars end, and there aren't any oceans there to do it in." "Yeah, but that's a lot less gravity to worry about on the way down." An NYPD teardrop cruised up alongside them, panels at opaque except for the driver's window, which was cranked back. A young cop up front had the system at manual and was steering idly with one tanned arm leant on the sill. She was talking to someone, but Sevgi couldn't make out if it was another occupant of the car or an audio hookup. Under the peak of her summer-weight Weblar cap, she looked casually competent and engaged. Memory twinged, and Sevgi found herself wondering about Hulya. She really ought to get back in touch sometime, see what Hulya was doing these days, see if she took the sergeant's exam again, if she was still hauling her tight man-magnet ass out to Bosphorus Bridge every Saturday night. Sit down somewhere for a good do-you-remember-when session. Maybe crack a case of Effis. At the thought of beer and the smell it had left in her kitchen, Sevgi's stomach turned abruptly over. She shunted the nostalgia hastily aside. The NYPD car switched lanes and faded in the traffic. Sevgi took an experimental stab at some engaged competence of her own. "Cryocap fluid should absorb a lot of the impact shock," she said slowly. "And the fact it came down in one piece at all means it was some kind of controlled re-entry, right?" "Some kind of." "Did we get any more out of the data head before this happened?" Norton shook his head. "Same request for standby at Kaku, same interval broadcast. Nothing new." "Great. Fucking ghost ship to the last." Norton lifted hands with fingers draped wide and low, made phantasmal noises to match. Sevgi curled a grin under control. "It's not funny, Tom. Beats me why the Rim Sky Cops didn't just vaporize it soon as it crossed the divide. It wouldn't be the first time those day-rate morons turned glitched air traffic into confetti when it didn't answer nicely." "Maybe they were concerned about loss of life," said Norton with a straight face. "Yeah." "Now, I hope you're not planning to bring that attitude with you, young lady. The locals probably won't be over-friendly as it is. This is our tin can that fell out of the sky on them." She shrugged. "They pay Colin taxes just like the rest of us. It's their tin can, too." "Yeah, but we're the ones supposed to make sure this kind of thing doesn't happen. That's why they pay their taxes. Have you talked to anyone at their end yet?" Norton shook his head. "No one human. I tried to hook whoever caught the case just before I left. Got the machine. Standard phone interface. It said we'll be collected at the airport by RimSec. 2 of their plainclothes guys, Ravio and Coyle." "You get ID?" Norton tapped the breast of his jacket. "Hard copy download. Want to see it?" "Might as well." The Rim cops were a balanced sex and eth couple. Under the label Detective A. Ravio, a dark, young Afro-Hispanic woman stared out of her photo with jaw set and mouth thinned, trying rather obviously and without much success to beat a full-lipped, hazel-eyed beauty. Belying the severity of her expression, her hair coiled thick and longer than NYPD would have let her get away with. Below her on the same printout, Detective R. Coyle glowered up, blunt-featured, middle-aged, Caucasian. His hair was shot with grey and shaved almost militarily short. The image was head and shoulders only, but he gave the impression of size and impatient force. Sevgi shrugged. "We'll see," she said. They saw. Coyle and Ravio met them off the suborbit SFO with perfunctory greetings and an iris scan. Standard procedure, they were told. Norton shot a warning glance at Sevgi, who was visibly fuming. This wasn't how visiting cops would have been treated on arrival in New York. Here it was hard to tell if they were being snubbed or not. Coyle, every bit as big and laconic as his hollow shot had suggested, showed them brief ID and did the introductory honours. Ravio took it from there. She leaned in and spread their eyelids with warm, slightly calloused fingers, applied the scanner, and then stepped back. It was all done with a detached competence, and among the streams of arriving passengers it had the intimate flavour of a European kiss on the cheek. Norton seemed to enjoy it anyway. Ravio ignored his smile, glanced at the green light the machine had given them, and put the scanner away in the shoulder bag she carried. Coyle nodded toward a bank of elevators at the end of the arrivals hall. "This way," he said economically. "We got the smart chopper." They rode up in silence, hooked a walkway across the glass-bubbled, white girder-braced upper levels of the building, then another lift that spilled them out onto a concrete apron where a sleek red-and-white autocopter sat, twitching its rotors. Eastward, the bay glimmered silvery grey in the late afternoon sun. A ruffling wind took the heat out of the day. "So you guys are on the case?" Norton tried as they clambered aboard. Coyle offered him an impassive glance. "Whole fucking force is on this case," he grunted, and tugged the hatch closed. "Badge coding 2347, flight is filed, let's go." "Thank you. Please take your seats." The autocopter had Asia Badawi's voice, low and honey-coated, unmistakable even off the half a dozen syllables uttered. Sevgi vaguely remembered reading, in some mindless magazine-space moment, while she waited to see the lawyers, an article about the software contract Badawi had signed with Lockheed. Big PR smiles and clasps all around. Outraged fans protest. Yawn. Flick. "Would you like to come through now, Miss Ertekin?" The rotors cranked in earnest. Engine murmur rose to a dim, sound-proofed crescendo on the other side of the window, and they unstuck from the pad. They settled into seats. The autocopter lifted, tilted, and whirled them out over the bay. Sevgi made an effort. "You get anything from the skin yet?" "Scanning crew are going over the hull now." The cabin had facing seats, and Coyle was opposite her, but he was staring out of the window as he spoke. "We'll have a full virtual up and running by this evening." "That's fast work," said Norton, though it wasn't really. Ravio looked at him. "They've been busy inside. That kind of took priority." An eye-blink silence. Sevgi exchanged a glance with Norton. "Inside?" she asked, dangerously polite. "You've already cracked the hatches?" A knowing grin went back and forth between the two Rim cops. Sevgi, fed up with being the least informed person in the room all day, felt her temper start to fray. "Horkin's pride is Colin's property," she said thinly. "If you've tampered with—" "Put your cuffs away, Agent Erdogan," said Coyle. "Time the coastals got out to your property, someone aboard had already blown the hatches out. From the inside. Quarantine seals long gone."
"That's not possible."
Narrowly, she managed to stop herself from saying it. Instead, she asked, "Are the cryocaps breached?" Coyle eyed her speculatively. "It's really better if you wait and see for yourself." The autocopter banked about, and Sevgi leaned forward to peer out the window. Below them in the bay, Rim Security's Alcatraz station rose off its island base in pale grey platforms and piers. On the southern shoreline, a floating dry dock complex was laid out like a schematic, clean lines and spaces, people reduced to dots, and vehicles to toys. The bulk of the Hawkins Pride crew section showed up clearly in the centre dock. Even with the external structures ripped away, even scorched and scarred by the re-entry, it leapt out at her like a familiar face in a group photo. She'd seen sister ships in the orbital yards above the Kaku nanorack from time to time, and she'd had archive footage of Hawkins Pride itself filed on her laptop ever since the ship stopped talking to Colin Control. In the frequent chunks of waiting room time at the lawyers' offices, in the sleepless still of the nights, she didn't drink. She'd stared at the detail until her eyes ached. "A good detective eats, sleeps, and breathes the details," Larry Kasabian had once told her. "That's how you catch the bad guys." The habit stuck. She knew the internal architecture of the vessel so well she could have walked it from end to end blindfolded. She had the hardware and software specs by heart. The names of the cryo-capped crew were as familiar as product brands she habitually shopped for, and biographical detail from each popped into her head unbidden whenever she visualized one of their faces. "It's really better if you wait and see for yourself." And now, at a guess, they were all dead. The autocopter settled with machine precision onto a raised platform at one end of the dock complex. The motors wound down and the hatch cracked open. Coyle did the honours again, levering the hatch back and jumping down first. Sevgi went next. Badawi's honeyed tones followed her out into the wind. "Mind your step. Please close the hatch behind you." Coyle led the way down the steps off the platform. There was a reception committee waiting at the bottom. 3 RIMSEC uniforms backing a plainclothes ranking officer whose face Sevgi recognized from a couple of virtual briefings she'd attended last year on gene print forgery. Smooth Asian features that made him seem younger than she supposed he was, thick grey hair and a rumpled way with clothes that belied the level scrutiny in the eyes. From that gaze and other general aspects of demeanour, she'd suspected he was probably enhanced. RIM officials of any rank usually were these days, but she never had any more evidence than the hunch. In the social sessions after, he'd talked with quiet reservation, mainly about his family, and his eyes had barely flickered to Sevgi's chest at all, for which she'd been quietly grateful. Now she scrabbled after a name, and the Sin handed it to her. "Lieutenant Tsai, how are you?" "Captain," he said dryly. "Promoted back in January, and I'm as well as can be expected, thank you, given the circumstances. I presume you'd like to view your vessel immediately. What's left of it?" Sevgi nodded glumly. "That'd be helpful." "I'm told," Tsai made gestures at his uniforms and they sloped off across the dock, "that we'll have a working virtual by about 7. Crews are finishing up with the hull now, but Rovile probably told you about the hatches." "That they were blown from the inside, yeah." "Captain," Norton weighed in, "we're concerned to know what state the crew of Hawkins Pride are in. Specifically, whether the cryo-systems were breached or not." Tsai stopped in the act of turning to follow the uniforms, and his gaze seemed suddenly to lengthen, dialing up out across the dock and then the bay, replaying something from memory that he'd maybe prefer not to. In Sevgi, the realization hit home suddenly that behind the turf-proud cool of Coyle and Rovile, there was the same base edginess, and that driving it all was not the jurisdiction envy she'd assumed. "They're scared," she suddenly knew. "And we're their only solution." It was an epiphany Sevgi had had once before, back when she was still a rookie with the NYPD and dealing with a drugs and domestic abuse case. Talking to the bruised and still swelling face of the perpetrator's mother, it hit her with the same sickening abruptness that this woman was looking at her as some kind of solution to her problem. That she expected patrolwoman Ertekin, aged 23, to do something about the shitstorm state of her family and her life. So nice to be needed. Breached, Tsai said slowly. Yes, I think you could say that. The outer hatches themselves were gone, blown clear by the emergency bolts. By now they'd be somewhere at the bottom of the Pacific. The blackened stub of Hawkins' Pride had been propped in the dry dock as close to a usefully even keel as her design would allow. Still, they had to clamber down into Access 4 as if it were a well cut into the top of the crew section's hull. A zero-G assist ladder took them to the bottom of the airlock chamber within, and from there they dropped heavily through the inner lock and onto the canted surface of the main dorsal corridor. Maintenance lighting glowed in soft blue LCLS panels along the sides of the passageway, but Tsai's uniforms had set up high-intensity incident lamps by the airlock and farther down. White glare bounced back off the grubby, cream-coloured walls, and teeth. Sevgi's gaze caught it as she came down off the last rung of the ladder, and she skidded to a halt on the side. The ripped-to-the-gums grin of a mutilated human head where it lay only loosely attached to the limbless torso sprawled on the floor. "You see what I mean?" Tsai climbed down beside her. Sevgi stood, managing her stomach. Leaving aside the hangover, it had still been a while. Even her last year with the NYPD had been mercifully short on gore. Transferring from homicide to Colin liaison hadn't made her any friends on the force, but it had certainly put a brake on the amount of mangled human remains she had to look at. Now she was vaguely aware that without the sin, she would have vomited up what little her stomach contained all over Tsai's crime scene. "Your crime scene, you mean?" "This is yours, Sev." She bent forward a little, peered at the dead man, took possession. "Alberto Toledo," said Tsai quietly, "engineer at the Stanley Bubble, atmospheric nanotech, 56 years old, rotated home." "Yes, I know." Bio-detail bubbled up from ruined, sneering face, whispering like ghosts. Job specs, resume, family background. This one had a daughter somewhere. The flesh of both cheeks had been sheared off up to the cheekbone, where stringy fragments of tissue still clung. The jaw was stripped. The eyes— She swallowed, still a little queasy. Norton joined her, put a hand on her shoulder. "You okay, Sev?" "Yeah, I'm fine." She locked onto facts. Hawkins' Pride hadn't talked to them for almost the whole 7.5 months of its long fall back to Earth. "Captain, this looks recent." Tsai shrugged. "Antibacterials in the shipboard atmospheric system, they tell me. But yeah, we're guessing Alberto here was probably one of the last." "The last?" Sevgi glanced at Norton as he said it and was pleased to notice that he looked as shaky as she felt. Distantly, she picked out the acidic tang of someone else's vomit in the air of the closed space around her. It was oddly comforting, the knowledge that others before her had seen and reacted in the same way she wanted to. It made it easier to hold on. "What happened to the limbs?" she managed, almost casually. "Surgically removed." Tsai gestured up the corridor. "They're still downloading the auto-surgeon's log, so we can't be sure that's how it was done, but it's the obvious explanation." "So how did he end up here?" The captain nodded. "Yeah, that's a little harder. Could be the impact threw the bodies about some. We found most of the cryocaps hinged open, nutrients all over the floor and walls. Looks like whoever did this wasn't all that tidy, at least toward the end." "The corridor locks should have engaged when she came down," Norton said shortly. "These ships compartmentalize under emergency conditions. There's no way something could get flung from one end of this hulk to the other like that. No way." "Well, it's only a theory." Tsai gestured up and down the unobstructed corridor again. "But as you'll see, not a lot of compartmentalization going on here. You want to look at the cryocap section?" Sevgi peered along the passageway to where more incident lamps lit the environs of the sleeper racks. She could see figures moving about down there, heard a couple of voices. The brief rattle of a laugh. The sound carried her back, with a force that was almost physical, to her crime scene days with homicide. Black humour and hardened camaraderie, the quiet thrum of an intensity denied to anyone who didn't work this beat, and the layering on of a detachment that came with custom. So weird, the shit you can get nostalgic for, girl. It alarmed her a little, realizing the extent to which, despite her quailing stomach, she did suddenly want to plunge back into that world and its dark, procedural workings. "The other bodies," she said as the sin lit up her head. "They're all mutilated like this one, right?" Tsai's face was a mask. "Or worse. Have you found the limbs?" "Not as such." Sevgi nodded. "Just bones, right?" "Oh, Ethan, you should have been around to see this. It really has happened this time, just the way you always used to bullshit me it would." "That's right." Tsai was looking at her like a teacher with a smart kid. "You've got to be fucking kidding," said Norton very quietly. Sevgi turned to look at him fully. It was reflex denial, shock, not objection. "That's right. Someone chopped these people up with the autosurgeon?" She nodded, still not sure, in the bright spin of the sin and the shock of the understanding, how she felt, how she should feel. "Yes. And ate them." Chapter 5. It was like a landscape out of Dali. The CSI Virtual was a forensics standard Sevgi remembered from her time with the NYPD. Pristine Arizona desert as far as the eye could see, blue sky featureless but for a ghost moon that carried the designer's logo like a watermark. Each section of the investigation presented as a separate 3-story adobe structure, distributed across the landscape in a preternaturally neat semicircular arc. The sectional homes were open on the facing side like cutaways in an architectural model, furnished with steps so you could walk up to each level. Labels floated in the air beside each structure. Neatly lettered fonts announced data anomaly, path labs, recovered surveillance, prior record. Much of the display space was still empty, data still to come, but shelved on the exposed floors of the path lab home, the mutilated corpses from Hawkins' Pride stood on their stumps like vandalized statues in a museum. Even here, not all the organic data was in yet, but the corpses had been scanned into the system early on. Now they posed in catwalk perfection, coloured and intimate enough to make your own flesh quail as you stared at theirs. Sevgi had already seen them close up, had focused with irresistible fascination on neatly sectioned bone in the densely packed meat of an arm taken off centimetres from the shoulder, and then wished she hadn't. The sin was wearing off, leaving queasy traces of hangover beneath. The Path Lab engine interface, a perfectly beautiful Eurasian female in tailored blue scrubs, narrated the nightmare with machine calm. "The perpetrator chose limbs because they represented the simplest transfer of the automated medical system's functions from surgery to butchery." An elegant gesture. "Amputation is an established procedure within the autosurgeon's protocols, and it is not life-threatening. After each surgical procedure, it was a simple matter to return the subject, still living, to the cryogen units, thus assuring a ready and continuing supply of fresh meat." "And the automed just let it all fucking happen?" Coyle was staring angrily about him, male outrage deprived of targets. "What the fuck is that?" "That," said Sevgi wearily, "is selective systems intrusion. Someone got into the general protocol level and closed down the ship's gin. For a good data hawk, it wouldn't be difficult. All these ships have a human override option anyway, and there's a fail-safe suicide protocol wired into the engine. You just have to trick it into believing it's been corrupted, and it shuts itself down. There are a whole series of secondary blocks to prevent that damage from seeping down into the discrete systems, but like we're hearing, he didn't need to worry about that. He wasn't telling the medical systems to do anything they weren't already programmed for.
He? Revial. Sevgi'd already pegged her as a staunch man's woman, and this looked like confirmation. Umbrage taken at potential feminazi chauvinism. Why's it got to be a he?
Sevgi shrugged. Because statistically that's the way it fucking is, she didn't say. Sorry, figure of speech.
Yeah, till we get the swab breakdowns back and find out it was a man, drawled Norton. He stepped past Revial's mutinous look, closer to the white-walled, opened architecture of the path home and its exhibits.
The lab face gave ground and stood in deferential silence, waiting to be directly questioned. Its higher interactional functions had apparently not been enabled. Norton nodded up at the exposed grin of a female corpse, and it leapt out at them. Visual distance was elusive in the construct. It bowed and swelled like a lens according to user focus. Thing I don't get is the mess. I can see killing them all. You don't want witnesses left around with or without arms and legs. But why the blood on the walls? Why mutilate the faces like that?
Because he was fucking cracked, Coyle growled. He probably ate that stuff as well, right?
Difficult to say. The lab face kicked in again, pointing and pulling in a bubble of data display from one of the other file houses. Evidence gathered from the kitchen unit suggests meat scraped from the skulls may have been cooked and ingested. This does not seem to have been the case with the eyes, which were gouged out and then discarded. Sevgi barely glanced at the yanked-in focus. It was in any case a little too abstract for easy human digest. Sketched molecular traces and a scrawled sidebar summary about microwave effect. Later she'd tramp over to the file house and review it at her own pace. Right now she was still staring up at the ruined face of Helena Larson, demodynamics specialist, psychiatric assessor. Divorced. Signed up for Mars not long after. Colin got a lot like this. You split from all you've known. Why not? Your life's columnar supports are crumbling all around you. You probably need the cash. 3 years, the minimum qualified professional tour of duty, seems suddenly reasonable. On Mars you earn big, and for the short timers at least there's fuck all to spend it on. You'll come home wealthy, Helena Larson. You'll come home with tales of an alien skyline to tell the children you'll someday have. You'll have the cachet of the trip to trade off and the resume potential it represents. You'll have moved on. Got to be better than sitting in the ruins of your old life, right? Better than clinging to whatever fragments you...
Investigator Ertekin?
She blinked. She'd missed what Coyle was saying to her. Sorry, just thinking, she said truthfully. What a...
I asked, said the cop, with a heavy emphasis of repetition, whether you think it's likely that whoever did this could still be alive.
The air in the virtuality, already a breezeless, sterile cool at odds with the desert landscape, seemed to slip a couple of degrees lower. Norton looked at Sevgi, and she felt the tiny, almost imperceptible nod come up from the roots of intuition.
Someone blew the hatches, Revial pointed out.
That could have been the automated systems.
Coyle cast a hopeful glance at the two Colin reps.
Right?
It's a possibility, Sevgi said. Until we see the damage to the automated systems and the engine, it's hard to know how the ship would behave on its own. But there was a steady thrum building in the back of her head now, like engines under decking, like the rumble of Ethan's voice, reading to her the time she came down bad with the flu, passages out of Pynchon that came and went blurrily as she faded in and out of focus with the fever. She snapped the memory shut, leaned into the cold sparkle of the sin, like wetting her face in a fountain. Look, we'll know if anyone got out alive when...
The swabs come in, Revial finished for her. Right. But in the meantime, what do you think? Give us the benefit of your Collins specialist insight. Could someone have made it down in one piece?
Outside of the cryo-caps, it's not likely, Norton told her. Habitual public statement caution, the Colin watchword. And even if they did, that still puts them 100 kilometers off the coast. That's a long swim.
Maybe someone came to get them. Ravio gestured at the empty levels of the recovered surveillance adobe. "We got no satellite stream data yet, no overhead incidentals. No way to know what went on before the recovery team got there."
Coyle shook his head. "Doesn't make sense, Alicia. Recovery scrambled as soon as they had the coordinates."
"Who'd they use?"
Sevgi asked, trying to sound neutral. NYPD had a long-standing superiority complex when it came to the RIM's subcontract policy on emergency services, an attitude born of and largely borne out by New York's disastrous flirtation with similar schemes in the past.
Ravio glanced at Coyle.
"Filigree steel, right? Or wait," she snapped her fingers. "Did they just lose the bid to X-Up?" "Nah, that was up in Seattle. Down here it's still the Philstee crew." Coyle looked around at Sevgi and Norton. "They're pretty good, Filigree. Did the job well over spec. Aerial cover inside 20 minutes, drop teams deployed."
"No way there was time for anyone to get in first. Either this guy's dead inside with the rest of them, or he took the plunge when the hatches came off and just swam off into the sunset."
"Wrong direction, then," said Norton dryly. Coyle peeled him a glance. "I was using a metaphor there."
"He does that sometimes," Ravio said, deadpan.
"I don't think he went into the water," said Sevgi. "You'd have to be suicidal or clinically insane to make that mistake."
Coyle stared at her.
"Were you there earlier today, Ms. Erdekin? Did you see the in-flight cuisine? You're trying to tell me this motherfucker might not be insane?"
Sevgi grimaced. This motherfucker, as you put it, had spent the last several months completely alone in deep space. Alone, that is, apart from the sporadic company of fellow crew members revived long enough to carve edible meat from. At a minimum, he is mentally unbalanced, yes, but—
Ravio snorted. "No shit, he's unbalanced. You'd have to be fucking unhinged to—"
"No." The force in the single syllable closed the other woman down. Words marched out of Sevgi's mouth, words she remembered Ethan saying almost verbatim. A cold conviction was growing in her. You wouldn't have to be insane to do these things. You just have to have a goal and be determined to attain it. Let's get this straight early on. What we've seen aboard Horkin's Pride are not the symptoms of insanity. They are only evidence of great force of will. Evidence of planning and execution shorn of any socially imposed limitation. Any mental problems this person was suffering by journey's end are going to be a result of that execution, not a cause.
"Speaking of planning," said Coyle, "you going to tell me you guys don't pack these colony transports with emergency supplies? You know, like food, in case someone wakes up unscheduled?"
"Nobody wakes up unscheduled," said Norton.
"Well, excuse the fuck out of me." The big cop looked around elaborately. "I'd say on this trip someone did exactly that. Woke up unscheduled and very fucking hungry."
"Or they stowed away," Ravio suggested. "Would that work?"
"That'd be next to impossible," said Sevgi. "There's a lot of security written into the launch protocols. You'd have to hack it all in the time between the ship's systems being enabled and the decouple."
Ravio nodded. "And how long is that?"
"About 45 minutes. It takes these older ships longer to boot up."
"Look, about this food." Coyle wasn't letting go. "We all know the Colony Initiative don't like to spend any of the cash they tax out of the rest of us on anything resembling people. But are you guys really so fucking tight you won't spring for a box of survival rations? What happens if something goes wrong mid-flight?"
Norton sighed. "Yeah, okay. All Colin vessels have on-board contingency rations, but that's missing the point. On each run, you'll have 2 qualified spaceflight officers cryo-capped separately from the passengers."
"The Hugh what?" Ravio asked curiously.
"Human freight." Sevgi finished Norton's slip of the tongue silently for him. "Yeah, we have some lovely terminology over at Colin. Contractual constraint, soft losses, quiet facts, profit drag, public perception management." She weighed in. NYPD commandments. Fuck finer feelings and circumstance. You back your partner up. Brusquely. What we're telling you is that there are two systems. The passenger cryocaps are wired to default into frozen. There's no point them being awake in an emergency. They're civilians. What are they going to do? Run around screaming, "Oh no, we're all going to die"? Onboard air's too expensive for that shit. They've got nothing to contribute in a situation like that, so anything goes wrong, the whole system locks. You can't get it open until the ship docks.
Coyle shook his head. Yeah, and what if the thing that goes wrong is that it thaws out?
How?
Sevgi gave him one of her best only an idiot looks.
You're talking about deep space. You know how fucking cold it is out there? There isn't enough ambient heat anywhere in the vessel to bring that system up a single degree from emergency frost. The only thing that might is the reactor, and that's programmed to jettison if it fails.
Yeah, okay. Ravio doing a little partner support of her own. Sevgi caught herself in sudden sympathy. It was like passing an unexpected mirror. So what about this other system? The spaceflight guys. They're wired to wake up, right?
They can wake up. Norton picked up again. Under certain circumstances. If there's a navigational emergency, the trajectory fails or you get unscheduled activity from the drive data head maybe, then the ship brings those two capsules up. Your spaceflight guys fix the problem or call in the recovery if they can't.
That's spaceflight guy. Singular, people. The sour voice in her head would not shut up. Because you taxpayers don't need to know this, of course. For about a decade now, we've been cutting back on emergency personnel by 50%. It's just so fucking expensive, you see, wasting a perfectly good cryocap berth like that. After all, this stuff almost never happens, right? And even if it does, who needs two pilots to fix it when one can manage? That's just overmanning, right?
Right, said Coyle. And these guys got to eat and drink, right?
Yes, of course. Norton gestured. Sevgi let him get on with it. Maybe from the long stay in Virtual, her head was starting to hurt. There's tanked water anyway for fusion mass, for radiation shielding, for the coolant systems. Even in the backup tanks, there's more than two guys could drink even if they stayed out there for a couple of years. And obviously there's food. But the supplies are calculated on the assumption that these two guys aren't going to be up and about for very long. If it's a simple problem, they fix it and then go back to sleep. If it's not, they'll send an SOS, and then go back to sleep until the rescue ship gets there.
What if the system won't let them refreeze?
Coyle wasn't going to be shaken loose of what was apparently an endemic lack of faith in technology. Maybe, Sevgi thought sourly, he'd grown up in Jesus land and immigrated to the Rim. Norton hesitated.
Statistically, that's so close to impossible that...
Not impossible, said Ravio lazily. Because my memory serves me right, that happened to some poor motherfucker about 7-8 years back. Exactly that. Woke up and couldn't get refrozen. Had to sit out the whole voyage.
Yes, I remember that too. Norton nodded. The cryocap spat him out and wouldn't reset, some kind of systems glitch. Guy had to sit out the trajectory until the recovery crew got to him. See, if the transport is close enough to point of origin, emergency systems turn it around and send it back to meet the rescue ship, which cuts the retrieval time right down. If they're closer to the end of the journey, they'll burn emergency fuel to speed up. However you cut it, you don't need that much food to keep someone alive until they're recovered.
Well, Sevgi parenthesized to herself, not if you luck out and get a friendly orbital configuration anyway. But we don't like to talk about that, guys. That's what we in the trade like to call a quiet fact. Sort of thing even accredited Collins staff won't necessarily have pointed out to them. Sort of thing you might have to dig a little for. But as Hawkins' pride fell silently, implacably homeward, Sevgi had done that digging. Detective Ertekin has a sound analytical approach to casework, her first-year homicide report had come back one time, and shows energy and enthusiasm in absorbing fresh background detail. She has a talent for adjusting rapidly to new circumstances. She did her homework, they were trying to say. And here, nearly a decade later in the heart of Colin, she did it again. Did her homework, and found that the distance between Earth and Mars could vary by up to a factor of 6.
Mars, it seemed, orbited elliptically, and that, plus the different orbital velocities of the two planets, meant that they could be anything between about 60 and about 400 million kilometers apart, depending on when you chose to span the gap. Even oppositions, Mars and Earth catching each other up, running temporarily neck and neck, so to speak, could vary by 1 million or more clicks. Colin transit launches took some account of these variations, but since the cycle worked itself out over several years, you couldn't just wait around and send all your traffic at the short end. That semi-famous, unscheduled wake-up guy 8 or so years back had gotten lucky, hit somewhere near an opposition with a trajectory down well under the 100 million clicks. This time around, the homecoming guy hadn't been so lucky. Hawkins' pride ate the thick end of the cycle, coming home across more than 300 million kilometers of cold, empty space. And no lunch stops.
"Okay," said Ravio, "so there's no SOS because the engine is down. But there's got to be provision for a manual backup, right?"
Norton nodded. "Yes, it isn't difficult to do. There are step-by-step instructions nailed up in the comms nest."
"And our guy chose to ignore them?"
"So it appears, yes. He ran silent all the way home, and presumably from somewhere close to the Mars end. There's not enough food on board to do that, not even for one person. You want to sit in silence and wait out the whole trajectory, you got to find something else to eat."
"So the guy is fucking cracked."
The tinge of told you so in Ravio's voice, bending back to her original assumptions. Okay, so she'd let this be a man, but she wasn't going to believe he could be sane.
"Got to be. He didn't need—"
"Yeah, he did." Sevgi said it to the air, detachedly. Time to run this for everybody's benefit. He did need to run silent. He couldn't call in the rescue ship, and he couldn't get back in the cryocap, assuming that it would have let him, because both those options would have defeated his whole purpose. A flicker of quiet. She saw Ravio shoot an exasperated glance at Coyle. The big cop spread his hands.
"The purpose being?"
"To get home free."
"Seems a little extreme," said Ravio sardonically. "Wouldn't you say?"
"No, it's not extreme." Sevgi could hear herself talking, but the words seemed suddenly heavy, hard to get out. The sin was deserting her, retreating from her speech centers, leaving her with the fading light of the inspiration, but no clear way to get it across. She fumbled for clarity. "Look, the spaceflight's a closed system. You dock in orbit. That's quarantine control, post-cryocap medical checks, ID download. A week, usually, before they let you down the nanorack elevator and out. Whoever this guy was, he didn't want to go through all that. He couldn't afford to arrive cryocapped with the others, and he certainly couldn't afford to be rescued. Both those options end at the nanorack. He needed to walk away unseen, unregistered, and this was the only way he could do it."
"Yeah, but why?" Coyle wanted to know. 6 or 7 months of cannibalism, isolation, probable insanity, risking a splashdown at the end of it all. Plus hot wiring the cryocap. That's got to carry some attendant risk, right? I mean, come on! How badly could you want to get home free?"
A wry grin from Norton, but he said nothing. Not for public consumption. Sevgi waved the diplomacy away.
"That's missing the point. It's no secret that there are people on Mars who wish they'd never signed up, who'd like to come home, but they're the grunts, the cheap labor end of the colony effort. This man was not a grunt. We're talking about someone who's at ease, manipulating cryogen and medical data systems, who's able to operate the onboard emergency landing protocols."
"Yeah, that's something else I don't get," said Ravio, frowning. "The whole trip, this guy's taking the passengers in and out of the cryocaps to feed off. Why not just kill one of them and stick himself in the empty freezer in their place?"
"Kinda hard to explain when they take you out at the other end," said Coyle dryly.
This is the end of the CD. The program continues on the next CD.